One of the keys to playing well after the flop is to understand board textures and how to adjust your game accordingly. The first step before you learn anything about strategy is to be able to recognize what the board texture actually is. Is it a neutral board? Is it a wet board? Or is it a dry board? If you can just focus on learning to recognize what the driest boards are and what the wettest boards are, and then learn the basic adjustments that you should make to your lines and bet sizings, will put you in a much better place to making better decisions at the poker table. So what I'm going to do in this video is first, we'll just establish what a dry board looks like and what a wet board looks like. And of course, we'll also talk about what a standard board might look like. So I'm just going to use this poker hand generator, which I'll put the link to in the description. And I'll just go through and I'll generate some random flops. And we'll just talk about which ones are dry, which ones are wet, and which ones are neutral. And then we'll move on to talking a little bit about strategy adjustments. We won't go too much in depth on that, but we will talk a little bit about just the basics. This is a heavily wet board. There's a flush draw possible and multiple straights. It connects very well with a variety of ranges. This will be good for just about anybody's range, both the raiser and the caller, maybe slightly better for a calling range typically. This is a dry board. It's a paired ace-ace queen board. It's better for a raising range. There is a flush draw possible, but this is still a dry board that will not connect very well to most calling ranges. So this would be considered a fairly dry board, maybe on the neutral side. This is another high-low-low board, generally a dry board, better for a calling range. Think of calling ranges has a lot of small to mid-pocket pairs and a lot of suited connector type hands. It's pretty much a neutral board, more on the dry side. This is a fairly wet board, better for a raising range typically. There are flush draws possible. There's some gut shot straight draws for some calling ranges, but this is typically going to be weighted more heavily toward looking good for a raising range. But it will connect somewhat to some calling ranges as well. Think about your 10-9s, your king jacks, your queen jacks, jack 10s, those type of hands. So this is the consummate wet board. It doesn't have a flush draw possible, but it just smashes the ranges of just about every calling range out there. Just put a Equilab hand range next to this board and you'll see what I'm talking about. There's lots of straight draws. There's, whether they be gut shot, overcards, there's several sets possible in calling ranges, 9s, 7s, 8s. Pocket 6s has a straight draw, pocket 10s has a straight draw, jack 10, queen jack, king 10, any 10x hand are going to have something going for it on this board. It's not the wettest board possible, but it's heavily leaning toward that side, and it's really good for most calling ranges. So this is a wet board. It's kind of good for both calling and raising ranges. Mainly slightly better for a raising range, but it's still got a lot going for it. You can expect this to be kind of an action board. There's no flush draw, but it's still a fairly wet board. So as you can see, we're kind of generating a pattern here. The higher boards are better for raising ranges and generally on the drier side, especially when there's a low card. You know, high, mid, low, or high, low, low are generally dry boards. We haven't seen a whole bunch of those. This is kind of one, high, mid, low. So this would be a dry flop. Flush draws do contribute to a board being wetter, obviously, but it's not the best determining factor. Connected cards, usually queen, jack, 10 high boards that are well connected and coordinated, are much better for being that type of wet board. Let me see if I can find one here. Something like this has a high card, has an ace card, which is obviously normally better for a raising range, but it also has 9, 10, and a flush draw possible. So this is one of those action flops where if you have ace queen here, you can expect to get action or re-raised or build fairly big pots on boards like these. And this is the consummate dry board. There's a flush draw possible, but imagine it was a rainbow board. This would be one of the ultimate dry boards. Ace 9-3, Ace 7-2, King 7-2, King 8-4. You know, those type of boards are generally dry. So now that you have a pretty good understanding on what a wet board, what a dry board looks like, and what is a better board for a raising and a calling range, we can kind of start building a strategy around that. So without going into too much detail, because that's beyond the scope of this video, you could do entire courses on building a strategy around board texture. But what I will say, but generally if you think about drier boards, it's going to connect less with ranges overall. So that means you're going to have less hands in your range and your opponent's going to have less hands in his or her range to continue with. So because of this, theoretically, we should be having more bluffs in our range, which means we are going to be more heavily weighted toward bluffs. So because of that fact, and because our opponent's calling ranges will typically connect less well to a dry board, we want to make smaller value bets when we do have a value hand to keep more parts of their range involved in the hand. So we generally want to c-bet bluff more, be more willing to, and we also want to usually bet smaller when it's a dry board. It's exactly the opposite when it's a wet board. More hands connect well to our opponent's range, so we will and they will be more heavily weighted toward, depending on which end of the board is the wet part, will be more heavily weighted toward either both of us or my range, a raising range, or his range, a calling range. So we want to do the opposite of what we did on a dry board and tend to make larger value bets because there's more parts of our opponent's range that could typically continue on a wet board. So we also want to bluff less on these boards. Since our opponent can play back at us and continue more often, we want to kind of weight our range a little bit less bluff heavy. Since we will have more value in our range typically, especially on the higher to mid wet boards, we don't have to bluff quite as often because we will have value more often. So bet larger, c-bet bluff less on the heavily wet boards, especially c-bet less on the boards that are much better for our opponent's ranges. So that's pretty much the basics of building a bet sizing or a betting frequency strategy depending on the board texture. The last variable that I will mention is when it comes to hand vulnerability. So if there are a lot of hands in our opponent's range that can continue on a board and possibly improve on a board, then we will tend to have a more vulnerable hand with, say, a top pair or an overpair. Now this can range from being slightly vulnerable to immensely vulnerable to not vulnerable at all to having absolutely no vulnerability. Think about having a boat on a flop. Your hand's not really ever going to be that vulnerable. Whereas if you have an overpair and it's a Jack 9-10 rainbow board, you're on a heavily vulnerable board. So the one strategy consideration you need to think about is when you're on a vulnerable board, you tend to want to try to get your value early and bet the first couple of streets. Let's say you have the typical top pair mid kicker and you're going for 2 streets of value when you want to generally bet flop and bet turn. And if it's a low vulnerability situation, you're typically going to be in a more polarized spot if your opponent does connect to a board. He's either going to connect very hard to it or generally have something very marginal otherwise. So we tend to want to get more late value. We don't have a vulnerable hand. We have a hand that we want 2 streets of value. So let's just check back the flop in position and tend to go for more of a turn bet, river bet situation, or a call on the turn, call on the river situation. Out of position, we can go for more of a check, call, check decide type line. I recommend going to a poker generator like this and just generating a bunch of flops and saying, okay, this is dry, better for my range. This is wet, better for his range. Wet, better for both of our ranges. A standard board, etc., etc. Pull up Equilab or PokerStove if you have that old software program and just pull up typical calling ranges. You know, your middling typical calling ranges of like pairs, suited connectors, and like your queen jacks, your broadways, that type of hand, and compare it to a bunch of these boards and see how many combos in that range actually connect with a board. If it's a lot of combos, it's typically a wet board. If it's not many combos, it's typically a dry board. If it kind of is good for both a raising, a bigger card, a higher card range, a stronger range, think of more of an under the gun or hijack opening range, then it's going to be better for the razor. So of course, before you can do all of this adjusting, you need to have a standard core strategy that you're playing, so you have a starting point from which to adjust from. Like if my standard line is this on a standard board, how am I going to adjust that strategy on a wet or a dry board, on a vulnerable or non-vulnerable board? Now I teach these type of concepts on my website, automaticpoker.com, so go to my homepage. You can sign up for my newsletter, and I'll send you a free poker strategy. It's not for everybody. It is a short or mid-stacking strategy because I believe that everybody should learn, initially at least, how to play cash game poker by playing a smaller or mid-stack before they decide whether they want to move on to playing a full or 100 big blind or a deeper stack. So check that out if you get a chance, and feel free to comment if you have any questions about this video or any questions in general. Thanks for watching.